Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here today. Blessings to you wherever you're calling in from. We're going to get started in just a few seconds here. So get settled and get ready for what I think is going to be a really great conversation. We're so glad you're here. You are here for our Land Justice Futures webinar titled Sacred Grounds and Right Relations, Working with Tribal Nations for the Care of Native Burials and Cultural Items. Today, we'll be speaking with the Osage Nation Tribal Historic Preservation Office and the Native American Rights Fund about the importance and best practices when it comes to the appropriate care and potential return of Native burials, human remains, and cultural items, both as a moral and ethical imperative, but also as legally required by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA for short. Unfortunately, due to the federal government shutdown, our third speaker, who is part of the federal government and the NAGPRA program, will not be able to join us today. But thankfully, we have two experts on NAGPRA with us who have lots of experience in this area and a lot of stories to share with us today. If you're new to our work, Land Justice Futures works with movement partners and religious landowners to heal stories on sacred lands by creating land transitions that are rooted in racial and ecological justice. With a holistic exploration of how racism, colonization, the church, climate change, and private property all intersect, we help Christian communities across the United States engage with the land discernment process as a prophetic opening for healing and repair. And we do that with communities, whether those transitions are happening in the next 3 years or the next 20 years. And just so that we're all on the same page, we define land justice as having 3 parts: protecting land from extraction and speculation, regenerating its health, and expanding stewardship, use, and governance to the communities who have been deeply harmed by dispossession, in particular, Black and Indigenous communities. And in this work, we are held by our many movement partnerships. You can see some of those here, which is also part of how this work was born. We are currently working with 19 religious communities across the US and are currently receiving applications to join our 4th cohort, which means you can find information about this program with the link in the chat. This is a little bit more about that focus community program. So with that, that's a little bit about who we are. But I am so curious, who are all of you? We'd like to know a little bit about who's in the room, and we're gonna do that by doing a little poll. Let's see. Amy, are you good to start our poll here?
Yeah, are you seeing it? Here we go.
Oh, great. Thank you.
There we go.
So we just do this for like 20 seconds or so. Who are you? Let us know if you are a member of a focus community. That could be staff or a sister or an associate who's part of a focus community program. If you're a sister who is not part of a focus community, if you're part of another faith institution or another faith community, if you're an organizer in movement, or if you're something else brings you here today. And then the second question there is, have you been part of Land Justice Futures programming before? We'd love to know if this is your first time, if you're on the newer side, maybe you've come to 1 or 2 things, if you've, come to quite a few things, or if you're like, yo, we know each other, we go deep, you're my fam. So it'd be good to know a little bit about who's here. And yeah, see a lot of fam on here. So, as well as new people. All right, if we're gonna wrap this up, maybe if you could finish answering these questions in the next 10 seconds, we will close the poll and share the results. Awesome. Okay. Well, with 75% reporting, we have a good mix, and a lot of our focus communities are here. That's so great. We have quite a bit of new people, uh, and that like 30% first time. That's exciting. Welcome. We're glad you're here. This is good info, so thanks for letting us know. And if you want to share in the chat also how, if you are new to us, how you heard about this. We're so curious, and also want to be meeting the desires to learn about this stuff. And so it's helpful for us to know that. All right, moving ahead. As I mentioned, we at Land Justice Futures work with religious communities and partners to move towards right relationship and heal stories on sacred lands. And we do that by creating land transitions that are rooted in racial and ecological justice. In the course of our work, we have encountered several examples of how religious communities, as well as other private landowners, conservation organizations, are often, even unknowingly, in relationship with Native burial sites and or Native American human remains or objects that have religious and cultural, spiritual, or other significance to tribal nations. We understand that the work of protecting and in many cases facilitating the respectful return of tribal nations and Native communities' ancestral remains and cultural items to be a vital part of the work of healing the harms of colonization. Through that violence of colonization, that is the attempted genocide, forced removal, and forced assimilation, which was and continues to be enacted through things like land theft, looting, boarding schools, and other tactics, settler colonial society has stolen from Native communities so much of what is sacred and core to their ways of life. For most, if not all, Indigenous cultures in what is now the US, the care and protection of ancestors and their burials is of the utmost importance. And yet, the burials of hundreds of thousands of Indigenous ancestors have been disturbed, and tens of thousands of human remains and cultural items have been unearthed, stolen, and are now in the possession or control of museums, private archives, universities, collectors, and federal agencies. There continues to be a large demand for Native American cultural items and remains on the black market. This disturbance and illegal acquisition has often been promoted by federal policy in the past, like the 1868 Army Surgeon General's order to collect Indian remains. For decades, archaeologists, scientists, academic institutions, museums, and others have used these Native American human remains and cultural items for different purposes, including for study, research, education, and exhibition. Some human remains and cultural items that have been collected or acquired simply sit in boxes, in storage facilities, or in family attics. In many cases, tribal nations and Native Hawaiian organizations, or NHOs, do not know the human remains or cultural items that these entities have. So, the theft of these ancestors and cultural items has been a hallmark of settler colonialism. And it's been a hallmark of the ongoing erasure of important cultural knowledge that continues to harm Native communities. Many tribal nations believe that as long as their relatives' remains are unreturned, they exist in a state of imbalance until those remains or cultural items are properly buried or brought together and returned to their proper resting places and in accordance with their traditional burial rites and customs. So without certain cultural items, Native communities may also not be able to practice certain religious ceremonies or pass on religious practices to their next generations. So it's time to repair these wounds. It's critical that we facilitate the respectful return or care of cultural items, even in cases where their items have been purchased or gifted through a genuine relationship. And even then, some Indigenous scholars maintain that it was impossible for Indigenous people to give their genuine consent that is required to give a gift under colonial power dynamics. So, as Native communities continue to revitalize their ways of life, their languages, their ceremonies, their forms of community governance, it's important to return what has been stolen so that they are able to reclaim what is sacred to them. That is why we're here today. So with that kind of framing and preamble, I'm going to pass it to Jesse just to briefly talk about how we sort of stumbled into this emerging part of the work through our existing work with sisters, which hopefully will also help contextualize for you all why this is important or how it might relate to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really wonderful to see you all here. So as Sarah said, our work with religious communities focuses on land discernment processes as a prophetic opening for healing, repair, and reorientation to right relationship. And over the course of the past few years, a few fairly specific scenarios or themes have begun emerging among some of our communities. There are some communities who are actively transitioning lands where there are known native burial sites, where the sisters know about them. And these communities brought us questions like, how do we protect those remains as we sell this land? What are our responsibilities to these native nations, to these tribal nations? How do we work with new owners so that these sites will be protected? Other communities have already protected a portion of their land for natural or green burials, while simultaneously being aware that many tribal nations are already or will be receiving ancestral remains as NAGPRA is continuing to be enforced. And if those tribal nations no longer have access to land in their ancestral homelands, these religious communities are willing to make burial space available to tribes if they would like to bury their ancestral remains in their ancestral homelands. So some of them have approached us saying, how could we go about doing this in the best way possible? We also have some religious communities who are not required to comply with NAGPRA in terms of federal requirements, but they desire to move deeper into right relationship and to work on healing the harms of colonization by acting in the most respectful way with Indigenous artifacts and sites. And so we received lots of questions over the last couple of years around what should we do in these various scenarios. And so we at Land Justice Futures started asking those questions. What should these communities do or these individual landowners? And we started looking for resources and honestly found very few. And those that we did find were not necessarily grounded in from a place of values or a commitment to right relationship. The resources often focused on the bare minimum that's required by NAGPRA and often focused primarily on the rights of the current property owner. So as we took our questions to experts in the field, we realized that a resource needed to be created to speak specifically to communities and individuals who do want to fulfill all legal obligations of NAGPRA and who want to center decolonization, repair, and right relationship in their treatment of sacred sites and sacred cultural objects. So that is how our learning has expanded and has resulted in this new guide. The guide is organized around 5 common ways that religious or private landowners are often in relationship with native burials, remains, or cultural items. The first is possession of native human remains or cultural items. Second is offering protected land for tribes' reburials on ancestral lands. Third, stewarding native burial sites or mounds. Fourth, dealing with potential native boarding schools burials on property. And the last is the excavation or inadvertent discovery of remains or items. And so with that, I will turn it back to Sarah to tell you a little bit more about the guidebook.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, so I believe in the chat you just received a link to this released today guidebook on these 5 common scenarios, as well as more background and explanation of NAGPRA. And we did this in response to this growing need and frankly a general lack of awareness among private landowners, our own general lack of awareness as well before this moment. And so we would love to share that with you and for it to be widely shared. We want to name that we did this in partnership. So the Native American Rights Fund are co-authors of this guide and provided a lot of expertise in editing it and maintaining its veracity, its legal veracity. And we also had consultations with TIPO officers from different nations and other NAGPRA officers as well, and are really grateful for all of the input that has led to this, including our 2 speakers today, Sarah O'Donnell from Osage Nation and Beth Wright. So thank you to all of our collaborators who have supported in the development of this resource. We hope that it is a helpful support for people who are wishing to act in integrity and comply with the law when it comes to protecting Native burials and or facilitating respectful return. And while this is, written with religious communities in mind, much of the information applies to many other private landowners, conservation organizations, and actors as well. So that's a little bit about that guide. We're excited to get into it. We're going to share stories today about these kinds of scenarios and situations. And I'm gonna invite our speakers up in a moment, but before I do, I just we've been getting into this habit of dedicating our webinars and taking a moment to center and be in some collective intention or prayer, if that's a word that's comfortable for you. So we're gonna do that for just a minute. So if everyone wants to, I just invite you, if you're comfortable, if you want to close your eyes, center on your breath, center in your seat, feel the ground underneath your feet, feel your body expand and contract with your breath. And as we begin, consider the long line of relatives, the lines of kinship, family, lifetimes, the many places, perhaps, that have led to your life on this planet, your personhood. Perhaps extend deep into the soil of where you live, or perhaps those lines cross continents and oceans. Consider the long line of relatives that connect all of us together as kin, as human family, and as the family of all creation. I invite you to send a pulse of energy, love, or care through those kinship lines to each other and through time and space. I'd like to center in a prayer for those ancestors whose rest and death journeys have been disturbed by the colonial practices of excavation, looting, construction, collection, exhibition. May they and the sacred and cultural items that are part of their journey find their way back to where they belong, to find the appropriate care for their rest and their continued journey. And may the native communities of those ancestors receive the care and healing that they need to thrive, to feel whole. May the truth and acts of repair bring a more free, more just world to all. And may we center ourselves in a common purpose to do our own part to support that healing, that repair, to bring truth-telling and courage to our own communities, especially Christian communities and institutions, to move towards right relationship. So with that, may we move with these intentions at our core, centering our listening, our thinking, our speech, and our actions moving forward. Thank you. Okay. With that grounding, I would love to invite our speakers to speak. Beth and Sarah, thank you so much for being here. It's been such an honor working with you on this guide and to have you here for this webinar. Really appreciate your time and wisdom and experience. If you could share a little bit about who you are and the work of the organization that you represent, we can get started. And maybe I'll ask Beth, will you go first?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Land Justice Futures, and thanks to Sarah O'Donnell as well for our participation on this webinar. My name is Beth Wright. I'm a staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund in our Boulder, Colorado office. I'm a member of the Pueblo of Laguna, which is a tribal nation in New Mexico. And part of my work at NARF is our NAGPRA practice. I work on NAGPRA specifically related to the return of Native American human remains from federal Indian boarding school cemeteries and burial sites. I am proud to do this work for NARF. NARF is one of the country's oldest nonprofits that's been dedicated to protecting and advancing the rights of Native people and Indigenous communities in the United States. And in addition to our NAGPRA work, we do a lot of work related to upholding treaty promises that the federal government made to tribes in the United States, protecting tribal nations' natural resources and sacred places, and among other things related to protecting tribal sovereignty and upholding tribal sovereignty. So I'm happy to be here, and thanks to everyone online. Looking forward to talking about NAGPRA and its importance.
Thank you, Beth. Sarah, would you like to share a little bit?
Yes, and I'd like to thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and Land Justice Futures for all the work you all have been undertaking. I know it's important work. My name is Sarah. I am an archaeologist. I've been working for the Osage Nation for over 10 years now. I've worked within the Osage Nation's Historic Preservation Office. The Historic Preservation Office has a mission to preserve Osage culture and history, and then share any information, any outreach and education with Osage constituents, Osage tribal members, and the general public when appropriate. Our office mostly is working with federal agencies, with museums, with state agencies, and with directly with private landowners and other private groups to make sure any of Osage cultural resources are protected. A lot of times that looks like what people think of as kind of archaeological sites across Osage ancestral territory. But my job specifically is to work within NAGPRA and to coordinate repatriations for the Osage Nation.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you both for the work you do. It's so, so important. I'd like to start just by contextualizing before we get into NAGPRA, why is this topic so important to Indigenous communities? And what do you think that non-Native people really need to understand about burial grounds, about ancestral remains, around sacred and funerary objects, items of cultural patrimony? These are specific terms that carry weight when we talk about NAGPRA. But can you share a little bit about what non-Native people really need to understand about those things, and if you could give a few, say a little bit about what those kinds of things are, some examples of what those things are. And Beth, will you start?
Sure, thank you. I think what's important about NAGPRA is understanding a bit about federal law that was in place before NAGPRA was enacted. In 1906, the Antiquities Act was the main law that covered Native American human remains. And what that did was it made Native American human remains on federal land, federal property. So it allowed federal agencies and federal officials to disinter, to dig up, to take, to steal Native American human remains for the purpose of using them for scientific studies or for museum collections. And this was a practice that, existed for generations. And I think it was 1987 was really when NAGPRA's predecessor laws sort of gained popularity. I think it was in that year that tribes found out that Smithsonian institutions held around 19,000 sets of Native American human remains. And what would come from NAGPRA's Senate investigation was that federal agencies and museums actually held between 100,000 to 2 million Native American human remains. And this was something that had destroyed, this practice of taking Native American human remains was something that had destroyed tribal nations' ability to transmit cultural practices from one generation to the next. A lot of these cultural items and sacred objects that had been taken are items that are used for actual cultural practices that Indian tribes and tribal people continue to practice today. And without those items, it's challenging, if not impossible, to pass on customs, religious practices, and traditions. And on top of that, Indian tribes were battling other federal policies that had prevented tribal nations' religious practices. I'm from a Pueblo nation in New Mexico, and the federal government for a period had banned our traditional religious dances. And so it was illegal to practice our religion. So combined with not having certain cultural items and sacred objects, and also being banned from practicing our religious items, our religious practices really took a hit and had to often be practiced underground. And so the loss of this culture is something that Indian tribes and tribal folks are still trying to build up today and restore today. And what we've seen with NAGPRA is that you're able to pass on religious practices from one generation to the next in a way that tribes have not been allowed to or able to in the past several generations. And we're seeing a restoration of tribal religious and traditional practices because through the repatriation process, older generations of tribal members are being able to teach younger generations of tribal members how to handle specific items and how to bring home and rebury a body. And so we're seeing a resurgence in those tribal practices. I can stop there and let Sarah add more.
Thanks, Beth. And I think that's perfectly said that, um, you know, for the Osage Nation specifically, the Osage have reiterated time and time again that the protection and preservation of their history and culture to be one of their highest priorities. And the Osage Nation as a government will consistently conduct 25-year strategic planning. So um, uh, it's a really interesting government practice of asking your constituents what they want the government to do. And every single time, Osage tribal members have come back and said that preserving both pre-contact and post-contact Osage heritage is the highest priority. And the Osage government responds to that by making sure that they're able to robustly engage with a law like NAGPRA, which provides this, you know, federal law, this framework to engage federal agencies, museums, and all these other entities throughout the country to ensure that Osage ancestors and Osage cultural items are, you know, put back where they belong. I think it's an incredibly important, you know, kind of, I think NAGPRA, sometimes if we're just reading it, seems like just kind of this realty transfer property law. But in reality, it's a human rights law, and it's really dealing with that universality of human dignity and talking about, you know, uh, how the Osage Nation, you know, throughout time and space is considering, you know, their relatives and their, you know, ceremonial practices and how important that is, and to feel like all of that is, you know, inalienable. There's no way, you know, to give it away. But there have been times in history that um, there has been kind of this effort to try and, you know, remove things from the Osage Nation. So it's it can be emotional work, but it is the most important thing that I'll probably accomplish in my life, and it is so impactful for, you know, not only the people I interact with when I bring them home, but also for their relatives today and also for future generations, hopefully, so they won't have to do that work. So it's really important, and it's something that's happening, you know, across the country with so many different tribes, and it's something that not a lot of folks know about. So, you know, always happy to speak about it.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you're both here to speak about it. Um, can you, before we dig more into NAGPRA, um, we've referenced a few things here: cultural items, sacred items, um, objects of cultural patrimony. I'm curious if funerary objects. I'm curious if you could um, help the audience here understand what they should be looking for if they're looking to see whether or not their community, their family, any institution that they are connected to has remains or cultural objects, cultural items. Can you name some examples of what they could be looking for, what those things could be? And Sarah, do you want to go first, since then I can
Sure.
find.
I think Beth and I are too polite, so you're gonna have to name one of us. We won't speak first. Um, I think that there are what's very interesting about NAGPRA, there are some things that are, immediately evident, which would be, I think, something like human remains. Funerary objects that we know came from burials, from burial mounds, from mortuary features of some kind. Um, from context, sometimes we can identify those fairly quickly. Objects, cultural items, as given a legal description in NAGPRA, objects of cultural patrimony and sacred objects can really differ depending on the tribe that you're talking with, you're communicating with. So every tribe is a sovereign with its own history and culture, and they have created different kinds of items and cultural and ceremonial objects that would kind of fit in those categories. Sacred objects are usually those items that are needed for a current religious or bringing back a ceremonial practice. Objects of cultural patrimony are items of such historical and cultural or spiritual significance. Not one person could own them, and therefore not one person could ever say, I'm selling this or giving this away. So they're owned communally by an entire religious order, or by an entire clan, or by the tribe as a whole. I know the example that we use sometimes is, if an invading army took over America and one random person signed a bill of sale for the Statue of Liberty, that's not anything. That's nothing. That's a random person signing a piece of paper. It doesn't mean anything. That's an object of cultural patrimony so significant to an entire people, an entire culture, that not one person has the ability to try and sell it or give it away. And I think oftentimes there's misconceptions about how some of these items ended up at museums, or how they ended up at universities or federal land management agencies. So we really have to interrogate any history, any context we have about how certain things ended up where they are today. And a lot of times that provides us enough context that we can start making decisions, and or at the very least, reach out to tribes so they can be the ones providing that identification.
Mhm.
That was a really good synopsis of everything, but I'll just add, I think it's up to the Indian tribe itself to decide what is or isn't a cultural item as covered by NAGPRA. So something that may not seem obvious to someone, such as a pot or a feather, something that someone might think, oh, that's just your everyday object. It's up to the tribe itself to decide whether that's a cultural item that's covered by NAGPRA, and to decide whether, the item is maybe not necessarily covered by NAGPRA, but it is still of religious or cultural significance for some other reason. I think also when it comes to Native American human remains, sometimes it's challenging to determine whether something is Native American human remains, because they can be small or they can be commingled with something else. And the way NAGPRA's regulations define human remains is that if you have human remains that are commingled with some other object, then that's human remains, even though it's hair that's been braided into a rope or something like that. That's still human remains. I've worked on some cases where locks of hair are covered by NAGPRA, and those locks of hair are human remains that the tribes do want back and want to bury. So I think it can be a large swath of what is included as a cultural item under NAGPRA's definitions, and so it's important to have and allow the tribe to determine what that is.
Mhm. Well, thank you both. I think we'll be able to hear more about of these kinds of examples and some of the stories that we'll get to. But before we do that, let's define for our audience, or share for our audience, what is NAGPRA, and any context that we can share about why it was an important law for the U.S. government to pass, and in everyday lay terms, what does it require of people in possession of Native human remains who are in control of burial sites or who are in possession of cultural items? And Beth, how about you go first this time?
Sure, thanks. So NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was passed in 1990, and what it was designed to do was to repatriate Native American human remains and cultural items that had been improperly acquired by federal agencies or museums, and to repatriate those, meaning to return those to the Indian tribe or the lineal descendant to whom they actually belong. NAGPRA also has a second provision which provides for the protection of Native American burial sites and ensures that if there is any sort of ground disturbing activity and there is a known or reasonably known Native American burial site, that is protected to the fullest extent of the law. What NAGPRA was designed to do was to essentially ensure the equal treatment of Native American human remains and cultural items. It was evident in the Senate hearing and Senate findings that Native American human remains and cultural items had been treated differently by federal law itself and by practices of the museum community, and other federal agencies. It was common knowledge that people weren't digging up the graves of non-Native people for display in museums or to study to determine some, you know, uh, racist scientific study. And so NAGPRA was passed in order to ensure that Native American human remains and cultural items were awarded and given the dignity and respect that they had been denied for so long.
Yeah. Sarah, is there anything you would add about NAGPRA and its significance or what it means for lay people?
Well, I think that's a perfect synopsis, and the only other provisions or of NAGPRA that I would want to mention for folks that, like you said, that just private citizens, especially, NAGPRA does prohibit trafficking of Native American human remains for sale or profit. So unless someone, I couldn't imagine the spectacular, instance that this would, have consent or some sort of approval from a tribe, especially going back into those early years of looting and collecting by random folks out on the landscape. Any human remains wrongfully acquired at any time, cannot be trafficked, cannot be sold or bought. And unfortunately, there is some traditions, and especially in certain areas, of collecting and looting and swapping artifacts and things like that. And so I think it is important for folks to know if you ever encounter anything like that, especially on the internet these days, that NAGPRA does prohibit trafficking of Native American human remains.
Mhm.
I'll also add that what NAGPRA requires federal agencies and museums to do is to inventory what's in their possession or control. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of the law is that if you are a federal agency or museum and you have Native American human remains or cultural items, you have to go through a summary or inventory of everything that you have in your possession or control, and you have to list it out, and you have to do so in consultation with the tribe so they can help identify what you have in your possession or control. And the purpose of that is because oftentimes these archaeological digs or this looting was done when tribes had no idea what was going on. And so federal agencies and museums built their collections by without the consent and knowledge of Indian tribes. So Indian tribes just don't know what federal agencies or museums have. And so this inventory is to provide that transparency about what is actually in your collection. And that's probably the most important piece of the of the law related to repatriation, because you can't repatriate if you don't know what someone has.
Right, right. Yeah, and just to clarify too, in case you're out there and like, well, we're not a museum, we're not a federal agency. One of the things that is part of the NAGPRA law is that it determines a museum to be anything can be a museum if it is in possession of any of these kinds of things and has received federal funding since 1991. And federal funding could be COVID-19 relief, it could be money for your like it could be USDA funding. There's a whole list of things that qualify as federal funding, which then places those organizations or institutions within the parameters of needing to comply with NAGPRA. Is that correct? Okay, yeah. And then yeah, to your naming, and you all can read about this in the guide. It gets into much deeper detail, but NAGPRA requires any of those institutions to do a number of things. One is to establish the cultural affiliation of those items or remains, and to do so in collaboration with tribal nations, and to create an inventory of those remains and any associated items, with the goal of establishing cultural affiliation, and then doing that written summary, that also helps kind of create the registry of what's out there so that it can be returned home. Is that an accurate way of summarizing more of like, this is what you need to do? Like, or if you want to say the steps differently, I defer to you, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's right. An inventory is done for Native American human remains, and a summary is done for other cultural items. And the purpose of the inventory and summary is to establish cultural affiliation or geographic origin of the remains or cultural items so that they can be repatriated. Because once cultural affiliation is established, then repatriation can happen.
Awesome.
And
Yes.
I would add on to that, why, we consider, creating an inventory and finalizing a summary kind of a process. It's because most museums and federal agencies actually don't have that much information about the majority of the things they have. Like, they might have some geographic information about where these things came from, but there is a lot of missing information, again, because a lot of these ancestors and cultural items were taken completely out of context by people who did not see them as people, right? So they're considered objects and treated as such on shelves and boxes, and not very good records, um, little to no just general information about these folks. And so the tribes have to be engaged so they can help make those identifications and help come to conclusions about that affiliation to which tribe. Because there are so many things that are under the control or physical possession of museums and agencies who NAGPRA's been in existence for 30 years, but those collections are over 100 years old. So there's a lot of work to do, and it really has to be done collaboratively in consultation with tribes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such an important point. I see, oh, thank you. I see a question in the chat from Sister Joni. Hi, Joni. But maybe it makes sense just to ask right here. Could you give some more detailed examples of what kind of items you might do inventory on? What's commonly, what do you find commonly there?
Well, an inventory is in NAGPRA specifically for human remains and funerary objects. And then the summary is for basically any other of the cultural items under NAGPRA. But in terms of, if we're going to use inventory as in checking boxes and making a list and sharing information, really we have to start with a really wide net, because there is not always good documentation or identification in the records of these museums. So there have been times, depending on the collection, where I will just ask for the basic list of all Native American objects at that museum and start from there and narrow in. Or I will ask them specifically for any and all ancestors or any archaeological collections just geographically from areas where the Osage Nation, considers they had ancestral territory. So there's not one particular artifact class, like a particular kind of pottery that I go and ask them about. Sometimes you can do that if you have a really good understanding of small collections, but we're usually talking to folks who have much larger collections, especially if you're talking early archaeologists, kind of full-scale looting of burial sites. They were collecting everything. So it's better to kind of cast a wide net, and then kind of narrow in as you consult.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let's get into some of these stories. I'd love to shift towards, we named some common ways that people might be in relationship to burials or cultural items or remains. And I'd love to give you both time to share a few stories of communities or institutions coming into compliance and returning ancestral remains or children's remains from boarding schools or cultural items. Yeah, what are some stories where the community or the institution did the right steps and it brought about some healing? Like, how did that happen? And Sarah, if you want to start with a story or two, and then we'll pass back and forth between you and Beth, maybe.
Sure. I think when we were looking over the 5 common ways that um, landowners and private citizens are in relationship with NAGPRA materials, I was really struck by an experience I had with the Osage Nation here that felt like kind of regular NAGPRA compliance and then kind of morphed into something else. So the Osage Nation is one of the kind of, as we consider it, the heart of Osage ancestral territories, Missouri. And there are innumerable sacred Osage burial mounds throughout what is now the state of Missouri. And in a particular small town in Missouri, there was a mound group, about 8 mounds, maybe 10. We don't know for sure, because unfortunately, very early on, settlers in that area, after the Osage were forced out, started looting the mounds and destroying them. Some were kind of very intrusive, kind of controlled looting into burial mounds, and others completely destroyed the entire mound structure. The Osage Nation was contacted by the state of Missouri years later to start their NAGPRA process. They wanted to start with human remains that professional archaeologists had excavated at that particular mound group in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. And when we started going through the records, we saw all these references from local townsfolk. Basically, you see archaeologists are out digging. A lot of folks will be curious enough to kind of wander over and start talking about the site and their known history. And they were sharing with the archaeologists, and the archaeologists noted that a lot of the local community members said, "Oh yeah, people used to come over here and loot," and they would call pot hunting. They'd come out and pot hunt and they would look for things. And then after storms in the disturbed areas, you might be able to see things. And they'd go into all these details. And of course, the archaeologists are just writing furiously notes, but no one came forward to hand over anything. They also referenced that another archaeologist had showed up decades before, but then he disappeared the next day and no one ever knew what happened or who he was, or no one remembered his name. And the state didn't have any records of who that was. So unfortunately, after reviewing all that information and knowing kind of generationally, a lot of those folks don't live in that town anymore. Um, that was kind of lost to us. That early history of looting, there wasn't one place I could have gone to go follow up to find those ancestors. All I knew were, where the ancestors and their funerary objects from the state of Missouri archaeologists, how we could get through NAGPRA that they had in their collections. And so we were able to move through that process, and it was a bit of an extended process. But I remember it happened right before the beginning of the pandemic and feeling really frustrated that I couldn't get, kind of the final steps of this NAGPRA repatriation completed because it was the pandemic and we were all stuck places and I couldn't be in a car with anyone and it was just awful. And about a week later, the phone rang here in my office, and it was someone that worked at a small private college in northern Missouri and said, "Hey, we had an archaeologist that used to work here in the 1950s, and it looks like he dug up these remains from this one mound site." And they told me the name, and I about fell out of my chair. So I didn't think we'd ever find who that mysterious archaeologist that came and left in a day was. And then about 9 months after that, I got a phone call from the medical examiner's office from a completely different location saying, we've had someone that wants to surrender human remains. Their grandfather had looted the mounds out at this particular location, kept them with them in their attic, and now a couple generations later, this person wants to do the right thing and feels awful about this and doesn't know where to go. And because it's human remains, of course, their first, concern was make sure this isn't a party to homicide. But once the ME confirmed that these were pre-contact Native American human remains, we were able to get a repatriation done, just in a few months. So what felt like, an impossible, out of reach historical, tragedy ended up actually with a pretty good resolution. And now we're really hopeful that, if the phone rings again, it could be more folks who may have found things, that previous generations had left from some of that, those pot hunting, the looting that happened out at that Osage burial mound site.
Thank you, Sarah, for that story. Beth, I'm curious, what stories are percolating in you?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about our work repatriating remains from federal Indian boarding school sites. So some of our main work right now regarding NAGPRA is involving returning and repatriating remains from Carlisle Indian Boarding School. And many folks may know Carlisle as the model institution for federal Indian boarding schools across the country. General Richard Henry Pratt opened Carlisle in 1879, and about 200 federal Indian boarding schools were modeled after Carlisle, which resulted in the death of thousands of Native American children and the destruction of Native American culture across the United States. And as a result of children who were sent to Carlisle, there were about 200 children who died because of their time at Carlisle and were buried at Carlisle. And today, that cemetery is on federal land, which is a active Army base in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and tribes are engaged in bringing home the remains of their children from that cemetery. And what's challenging about these returns is that the Army has long said that NAGPRA does not apply to them, even though NAGPRA is clear it applies to federal agencies specifically. And because NAGPRA does not apply to them, the Army will not return remains to tribes. It will only return remains to closest living relatives, which has become an impossible burden for some tribes because identifying the closest living relative of a child who died over 125 years ago without any lineal descendants of their own, and as a child, some were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 when they died is an impossible task. And so we've worked with tribes to bring home remains under the Army's process for the return of remains and under NAGPRA. Some tribes have gone through decades of research to be able to figure out who they can designate as the closest living relative in order to bring certain family members' remains home from Carlisle. And other tribes have said, we have a right as an Indian tribe to repatriate under NAGPRA. We're not willing to use our time, our resources to comply with the Army's ridiculous policies, and we're just going to go through NAGPRA. And so the Army's been resistant to returning remains to Indian tribes under NAGPRA. So that's a case that we're litigating right now on behalf of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska. They had 2 children who were sent to Carlisle in 1895 and 1899, and they have sued the United States Army under NAGPRA to return those remains. And the Army's position has long been, NAGPRA doesn't apply to us. We don't have to return remains under NAGPRA. And it's been a challenge going through this lawsuit because oftentimes you're talking about something that's very sensitive and emotional to a lot of tribal folks and tribal leaders. And so it's hard to litigate this type of case. But Winnebago was one of the tribes that fought hard for NAGPRA's enactment. Their tribal leaders were testifying in front of the Senate about the importance of NAGPRA in the 80s and 90s, and they're committed to ensuring that the Army respects their NAGPRA rights today. So they haven't had, the case hasn't been decided. We just argued that case at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a federal court in Virginia, and so we're waiting the outcome of that case. And so Winnebago still hasn't had their remains of their children returned to them. But other tribes who have gone through the Army's process and who have been able to identify a closest living relative per the Army regulations have had their children returned to them. But the way the tribe sees it is that, NAGPRA was enacted for tribes. It was enacted to ensure remains like the very ones at Carlisle could be returned to tribes under specific policies. And so Winnebago is willing to fight the Army in federal court to uphold their NAGPRA rights.
Mm-hmm. I think I just want to pull out a few things that you've mentioned here. One, I think one thing that these stories illuminate is complying either legally or just because it's the right thing to do with NAGPRA, can involve a lot of ongoing collaboration and consultation from tribal nations. It takes a while to establish some of these things. You mentioned, that it's hard to sometimes find lineal descendants of children at these boarding school burial sites. And, it's important to name and the record keeping in those boarding schools wasn't always consistent or even consistent with the memory or the names used within those tribal communities. So, it takes time, and the important thing is to be in dialogue with tribal nations as they do the work to find the answers that can show us the right way forward. You're mentioning a case of resistance. I'm curious, Beth, could you share a story of an institution or a community that voluntarily wanted to do the right thing, even if it wasn't necessarily required by NAGPRA? And what are some examples of taking the right steps and being in the spirit of the law?
Yeah, thank you. I unfortunately don't have too many of those because by the time you get lawyers involved, it's usually because the institution does not want to do the right thing. But I do have a story that has a good result. I think folks might be familiar with the largest mass execution in United States history, which was authorized by President Lincoln in the 1800s. It was the execution of 38 Dakota warriors who had fought the United States in the Sioux Wars. Just brief background, the Sioux Wars were basically uprising by tribes in South Dakota and North Dakota in those areas because the United States had not upheld its treaty promises to the tribes. The tribes had ceded hundreds of thousands of acres of land to the United States for certain promises from the United States. The United States had not kept those promises and people were starving. And so the tribes fought the United States in a series of battles, and as a result, President Lincoln authorized the hanging of 38 warriors. And what happened after the bodies fell to the ground was that American soldiers cut the noose off of the dead warriors and would keep the noose in their collections. And so we came across scenarios where private collections and historical societies had some of these nooses still in their collection. And in a way, it's not clear whether the noose would be covered by NAGPRA specifically because it's not technically, it doesn't necessarily fit within the cultural item definitions as a sacred object, an object of cultural patrimony, or a funerary object. But what the noose had represented was the need for the tribe to recognize the sacrifices those warriors made for their tribal nation. Sorry, it always makes me really emotional. And the need to bring, and they didn't necessarily have the bodies of those dead soldiers, but they knew that they had the nooses of, that caused the death of these soldiers. And so bringing home those nooses would allow the tribe to bury a part of the warriors that they never got to bury. And so we were really thrilled to see these institutions not necessarily, there was some resistance for a while, but they were willing to return the nooses to the tribes because of that historical significance that the nooses had represented to the tribes. It was honoring the spirit of NAGPRA to say these aren't necessarily items that are covered by NAGPRA, but we recognize how important these items are to the tribe and what they would mean to the tribe to have them back. And so we're going to return those because of that. So I think that's an example of scenarios where NAGPRA might necessarily not cover an item, but the tribe has expressed the need and the desire and the importance of having this item back. And the institution just listened and was willing to return those items.
Thank you for sharing that powerful story, and thank you for letting your tears be with us too. Yeah, this is really heavy stuff, and the return of these remains, these items, like it carries a huge emotional weight. And I think that's something that we really want to communicate in this conversation too, is like doing the right thing also carries a huge weight, that is in the interest of healing and in the interest of repair. Sarah, I am curious if we can bring in some other kinds of examples and stories, including ones around, development and excavation and construction, and examples either of a community doing the right thing or a project doing the wrong thing. Either of those things can be educational.
Yeah. Well, mm, I'll start with a difficult scenario to end on a light note. I think a situation that the Osage Nation encountered when it comes to developers, especially on private property, depending on how they have structured their compliance with local or state or federal regulations, they may or may not have some sort of federal nexus where they have to comply with um, usually Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which would kind of allow the tribes to consult on those projects and say, hey, you're building your houses a little too close to something, or could we re-engineer, this road into this, neighborhood so it stays away from an area? Could we create a little green space now in where whatever you're developing that it keep, no ground disturbance in certain areas? And um, if what we're seeing, at least in Osage Nation ancestral territory, which spans across about 15 states, um, most private developers are trying to find ways around that. They're looking to develop things as quickly and as cheaply as possible. So, for example, there was a development that was large houses being built, a small neighborhood, and they're very careful that the house structures would not cross kind of an imaginary boundary line within a certain jurisdictional limit of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so they would not have to go through any sort of federal permitting. And because of that, there is no trigger for any state agency to know they were building in the middle of a National Register listed archaeological district that was full of villages and burial sites, ancestral Osage villages and burial sites specifically. So we had here at the Historic Preservation Office had no clue that anyone was doing anything out there. Usually things are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They're kind of known in certain ways, right? So there's things get pinged at any sort of permitting agencies at the local or state level. Usually we, flag is on the play, right? We were notified of this development in this area because during the construction phase, they were digging very deep basements and split level garages. Um, some folks were walking across, well, they were trespassing, but some folks were walking across the building area, the construction area at the middle of the night, and they stumbled across exposed human remains. So immediately they called the police because they thought they may have stumbled across a crime scene. The police came out. They realized these were very old remains. They called an archaeologist, and we eventually were notified, not by any of the State Historic Preservation Office, the county planning board, or anything like that. What happened is the people that reported it after they called the police, they called the local news, um, and those folks then met the police out there, and then a local archaeologist saw on his local news, and then he called us, and then we started calling everyone. And so it was a great big mess right at the beginning, and we tried to work with that developer to say, please, could you re-engineer? Could we do something? And, basically what we started hearing in this case, and unfortunately we keep hearing is, there's no law saying we have to. The state burial law that protects burials in this particular instance, it's not proactive. So once you find a burial, you are required to report it, then that burial site is protected and you have to consult with the State Historic Preservation Office. What became apparent to folks is unless someone proactively reports they found a burial, how does anyone know? And so we found out later that that same developing firm started hiring round the clock security on their construction sites to make sure no one ever accidentally walked across an open construction pit and saw something they shouldn't and reported it. And we've also then gotten phone calls from the contractors who are the guys running the track hoe or the dozers, And they've basically will call like a whistleblower, call our office and say, they're telling us if we call anyone, that the whole entire project will be shut down and we'll all be fired tomorrow. And I said, well, no, we'll have a discussion about what our options are. And, but it has been really frustrating to know now that even accidentally, we don't have a way of being confident that any human remains in that area are being reported and then therefore, notified to the tribes. And then, decisions are made in consultation about how to protect them. So overall, we're seeing a lot of these developers realizing that, this will slow us down and they want to do anything. Then what we've also started getting is concerned neighbors calling and saying, hey, actually my family's lived here for 6 generations and we know what's out there in those woods. And now they want to come out and destroy that area and put in houses. We have to call someone now. And we know that a lot of times those folks giving, us a heads up, their relatives were the ones, maybe the reason that they didn't tell anyone in the first place is they liked going out there to collect. So it's really a tough one. But that has been really difficult to try and figure out, okay, then what is our recourse? At that point, we have to start talking to a state government and say, can we write and help you write a better burial protection law that protects unmarked or, Native American graves in your state? Because if it's not on federal land, NAGPRA doesn't apply.
Mhm.
So that one was difficult and incredibly frustrating. But we also have other instances where we have folks that own a lot of land, or small parcel, I guess I should say, and they take it upon themselves to be good stewards. And that those times are just, I'm just always so thrilled when I meet those people. There's a particular Osage burial site in Missouri where the landowner his property is right next to kind of the main area of a burial site, and he has a few burial locations on the edge of his property, and he's always been so protective of them. He has, doesn't like people out there. He'll call with updates. He'll let us know, even if he thinks like there's little burrowing critters, he's like, what? All right, we're going to have to put out predator urine. And I'm like, yes, we are. All right. And we have a lot of great conversations, but there was a big flood a couple years ago, and there's a little bit in the creek below some of these burial locations kind of slumping and some erosion, and he saw a bone in the bank of that creek. And so he immediately called and said that this might be human. I don't know. I'm not going to touch it. I don't want to even take pictures. And we said, well, one, great. We prefer that there are no pictures of ancestors, without their consent. And so I called over to some archaeologists that were nearby and begged and pleaded and offered them, to buy them many beers if they could drive out immediately, which they did. They didn't need the beers. And they were able to call me back within about 20 minutes and say, it was a deer bone. We're all clear, no problem. And, the landowner was a little embarrassed. He was like, oh, I've wasted everyone's time. I'm so sorry. We all now have like, adrenaline hangovers. I apologize. And I said, this is the best option. This is perfect. This is exactly what we want to be happening, which is this communication and collaboration and quick response. And this is the exact kind of stewardship we're looking for. It's not that you have to know the answer to every problem. It's that you just know that there's someone on the other end of the phone or email that can help, and we can work together to resolve these things. So, for every kind of unethical developer I have to deal with, we then also have these amazing private landowners that are such great stewards. And, oftentimes they're also very welcoming, and they'll let me bring Osage constituents back out to pay their respects to their ancestors on their private property. And those have also always been really, really special moments.
Thank you. That's just so heartwarming to hear. It's like I want to pull out just this sense of like that story illuminates, I feel like, what is so at the core of NAGPRA and this work of like, it's up to all of us to uphold the dignity of all human beings and all peoples. And like, it's it we are entangled in this moment um through the colonial project, and like we have to take responsibility for the ways in which we can impact the dignity of others, including those who are laid to rest in places that we might have possession or control over. And sometimes that means stewardship in the way that, you know, that tribal nation has requested, and sometimes that might mean something else, um like the repatriation of those remains, or doing land back to support that tribal nation in actually having control over how those ancestors are cared for. And so I want to pull that out of like, this is a it's a really good reminder that like this process can actually bring us closer together. Like the process of repair can be a really humanizing experience for everybody, including, you know, the non-native guy who has burials at the edge of his property. Um, so thank you for that story. I'd love to ask about a story that we can't be very public about, but I'd love to touch on one thing that we haven't discussed yet, which is, you know, potentially having sites for reburial. Um, and you know, Sarah, you have um, been working with a community that we work with. Um, and I'd love for you to share what you can about what that process has been like, and what opportunities there are for folks who own land on ancestral territory. I mean, everything in the United States is an ancestral territory of some peoples. So, but who own land and are open to it being a site of reburial for rematriated remains.
Um, so I can't go into too much detail, but I can say that, you know, the Osage Nation has met with several different religious orders who historically had contact, or, you know, kind of that entangled history with the Osage Nation, in, you know, school settings, missions, you know, and other places. And so we've had a couple of groups, religious communities, kind of start talking with us about not only some of the school aspect of it in terms of archives, but also in terms of, you mentioned, you know, that there might be cemeteries or burial grounds that were at those locations or at current locations that religious orders are in charge of. And so we started out really speaking with religious communities that kind of had the archival information, that we were really interested in learning more about the Osage experience with that particular order, and the sisters that, you know, if they had their own archives about, you know, their side of what happened. And it was just a wonderful experience talking with folks, and having an opportunity. Through that, we really started being able to contact other communities, and in particular, a community that currently does have an ancestral Osage burial site on their property, and start discussions about what long-term management looks like. So, you know, some communities are going through kind of, you know, land sales or some sort of disposition of different resources. How is that going? How is that going to converge with all of our different interests? And also, I feel though, when we have been having these discussions, it has been such a marked difference than my formal consultations with like federal land management agencies, who of course they are good stewards many times, but at least so far, the religious communities we've worked with have been really willing to listen and to think about stewardship from such a just like there's such a depth to our collaboration. Um, it's been a real positive experience so far. So we haven't done we can't announce anything unfortunately, but we're really looking forward to the day that we can, because we have been able to kind of agree to a commitment to um, find some ways to have long-term preservation and protections around these burial sites.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're excited about those developments and imagine there could be more in the future with the communities that we work with. And yeah, just to make it explicit, you know, we don't want to jeopardize anything that's in process, but also just to reiterate the point from before, like these are really sensitive um, collaborations, also because publicizing any information about a burial site could invite looting. And so this is part of the reason why these kinds of discussions and collaborations need to be done with such care, and directly with tribal nations and the landowning community or individuals. I think we have a few questions from folks in who are with us on this call, and we'd love to give that some time too. So let's see. Great. I'm gonna start with just there's a question here about who do we bring if people go to their communities and they find and start working on an inventory or a summary, who do they bring that to? And yeah, how do they make that information known to the organizations or the federal agencies that need to know about it?
Well, if you're talking about materials, potential NAGPRA collections, do you mean, Sarah, the collection that might be owned by a federal agency? Is that, want to double check your question?
No, I think this is probably from private individuals. This is from Caitlin. So if Caitlin wants to illuminate
Oh, okay.
her question, uh,
In terms of, well, I'll assume it's in terms of finding the right tribe to talk to.
let's see, Harry. Yes, Caitlin says an inventory of a collection owned by a religious order.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. So I would always start with the National NAGPRA Program's online database of tribal points of contact. So most tribes have shared their point of contact information for NAGPRA for repatriations with the National NAGPRA Program. So there's a database. So if you know generally what tribes you're looking for, that information should be there. Another great resource is looking up the tribe's tribal historic preservation officer. Many tribes have THPO, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and they're the folks that are usually kind of the externally faced person that is working on compliance with a lot of different laws. And so if they are not the NAGPRA contact, they usually know who is and can get you to the right person.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And can you put that link of the database in the chat, Sarah, if that's easily doable for you?
Sure.
That'd be wonderful. Beth, do you have anything to add to this question about what to do with an inventory or a summary?
Yeah, usually inventories and summaries are published in the Federal Register, and that's just so you're trying to have wide dissemination of the information, but there are lots of ways to reach out to folks to let them know this is what I have in my collection, who wants this back. But a lot of this the inventories and summaries are done in consultation with tribes, so you should already have that relationship through the inventory and summary. But the Federal Register notice publication allows a wider breadth of folks to be able to see what's in the collection.
Great. Yes. And that's a good clarification. In order to create the summary or the inventory, that kind of requires you to already be in consultation with tribal nations so that they can best describe what you have. So hopefully that will have already happened. But I'm hearing also like the Federal Register and the NAGPRA database points of contact are good resources. And then also just looking at your TIPO, your local TIPO or the TIPO of the community that was originally connected to where you are or where those collections come from. And Sarah or Beth, do you want to say anything about SHPOs, like the state history, like where if they can't find a tribal council or a TIPO, like should they go through the state historic preservation office as well, or what role, if any, should they have?
Well, SHPOs should have a list of the consulting tribes in the area, but they are usually not a party to NAGPRA unless you're talking about their collections under NAGPRA. So it just depends. But SHPO might be able to point you in the right direction. But usually you're wanting to talk with the tribes directly if you can. And then it is always, it's never inappropriate to, if you find one tribe and you're not sure who else to send something to, ask the tribe you're talking to, is there anyone else I should contact? They might be able to tell you. Here are other tribes that usually consult in our general area and point you in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you. And again, a lot of this can be found in the guide too, but I think we're actually getting even more detailed here, which is helpful. All right, we have another question. Let's see. Let's see. There's someone who is naming that there's a museum in Missouri that may have artifacts. And they ask, who may I talk to offline about this? And what would you say to people who know of these artifacts or objects?
Well, Missouri is kind of part of my bailiwick, so feel free to email me. But that collection, just because it lives in a Missouri institution, university, museum, doesn't necessarily mean the artifacts are from Missouri. So I'm always happy to help. I will say sometimes, because of how sensitive NAGPRA is, Osage Nation usually isn't, commenting publicly outside of like confirming if certain museums are in active consultation. So if they are already in consultation, I could let someone know they're consulting. Yeah, if there's a museum that may or may not have started complying, you can email tribes about that, let us know, or email even the National NAGPRA program, and just alert them that there are Native American artifacts in this museum. They should probably already be aware, but if not, they can also look into things.
Thank you. Beth, anything to add to that? No? Okay. We also have a question here from Susan. Hi, Susan, of the Loretto community. She says, we have a natural burial cemetery in Kentucky, and we're open to tribes who might want to bury remains on ancestral land. Do you think tribes might be interested in burying remains in our cemetery, or would they want to repatriate remains back to areas where tribal members currently live?
Well, I would say that just depends on the tribe. For the most part, I could speak for Osage Nation. Osage Nation is more interested in reinterning folks back to where they were laid to rest by their family members. So we're usually looking for reburial locations that are somewhere near where they originally came from. But there are other tribes that, feel differently and have made different choices. So it really depends on the tribe. I think that a lot of tribes, however, are looking for more reburial locations because locations are at a premium, especially locations that have, you know, protections, are, secure in some way, have either they need to be so remote and inaccessible, it's highly unlikely looters would stumble across them, or they're so visible because they're a part of a known area, or they're, people are driving by all the time or live nearby, that then that kind of affords a different kind of protection. So each tribe kind of makes their own decisions when it comes to setting up reburial locations. But it's always, at least in my perspective, always wonderful to get an offer from any institution that has land throughout Osage ancestral territory, letting us know they might be open to developing a reburial area.
Beth, do you have thoughts on this question about burying remains in a cemetery or repatriating remains back to where tribal members currently live?
I think Sarah said it perfectly. I think a lot of tribes, when it comes to bringing home remains of children who died at boarding schools, have specific reburial places on their traditional lands. And so I think, like Sarah said, it really just depends on the tribe. But yeah, there are a lot of different ways tribes want to do it.
Thank you. Thank you both. Just to pull out a few things that you both are naming. One thing that we've learned in a lot of these conversations is like, don't assume, like, if you're in any of these situations, don't assume that you know what the tribe wants. Like, to you it might make sense, to keep an ancestor or a child in the ground where they were buried. But it might not be what the tribe wants, or it might make sense to you we have to return these remains to the tribe that they belong to, and the tribe might actually prefer that they stay where they've been buried. And so it's just really important to recognize that these are extremely sensitive decisions. Even the decision to like use ground penetrating radar or cadaver dogs, like those can be things that tribes really feel are invasive to their relatives' peace and to any of the other like cultural practices associated with the burial of their relatives. So it's just to name like best to not assume anything and just be in dialogue with the tribal nations about their preferences, their protocols, like this particular situation. Because as I've heard from both of you, every situation is different and unique and might call for a particular course of action that is in dialogue and requires collaboration and creativity in some ways, perhaps. So that's one thing I'll say. And then the other thing that you mentioned, Sarah, is state burial laws. You've just named this a couple of times. Like NAGPRA applies to federal lands, but also anything that has received federal money. And then there's also state protections for burials that vary state by state. And some states have really strong protections and some don't. And so one thing you named is like, if you are a community that is interested in receiving remains for reburial, looking into the ways in which you can protect those sites, both legally and just practically, is really important and to be done in consultation with tribes. Okay, two more questions that we have here. One, some tribes do not have federal recognition. How does NAGPRA apply? Beth, would you like to take this one? Thank you.
Yeah, NAGPRA typically only applies to federally recognized tribes, but there are some states that have state NAGPRA equivalency, and so there may be a state NAGPRA law that essentially incorporates all of the protections that are in the federal law into state law, and those would apply to likely any tribe within that state. But like we've discussed, just because NAGPRA might not apply to all tribes, it doesn't mean that you can't, comply with the essence of NAGPRA and return certain things.
Thank you. Sarah, you're nodding your head. I'm assuming you don't have anything to add, Sarah. Okay, great. We also have a question about like what kinds of items might be of interest. Someone asked, I found arrowheads, spearheads, and other small such items. Are they of interest?
Well, I would typically recommend to not collecting anything that you find when you're out on federal land or private land or state land. It's important, that these items remain where they are. They could have been placed there for a specific reason and are intended to remain where you see them or you find them. But if you have them, it makes sense to reach out to the tribes whose land you found them on. There's a way to kind of figure out whose traditional land that may be, even if it's federal land or private land, and reach out to those tribes to let them know, I have this, I found this when I was doing this. What can I do with these items?
Sarah, anything to add on this kind of?
No, I mean, I would echo Beth's first point, which is, we really prefer folks don't pick up anything. And, we have put out on our OsageNationCulture.com a little webpage saying what to do if you see an artifact out in the wild while you're walking along a creek or anything like that. And really what we prefer is, folks just photograph it in place, note where you are, and then report it to, whoever, might have an interest. So if it's on federal land, the federal agency, if it's on private land, the state historic preservation office, or you can, of course, always reach out to tribes specifically. Yeah, I would also recommend, like Beth did, to reach out to the whatever tribe is from that area where those were found and ask them if are things of interest, and make sure that there's nothing in there that needs to be brought back.
Okay, well, we're rounding out our time together. Just have about a little over 15 minutes left. And I'd love to just have a little embodied check. How are folks doing? Like, if you want to chime in the chat, like, how are we feeling in this discussion? How is this conversation moving in you? What reactions are coming up or feelings are coming up? I'd love to just have a moment to process together what it's like to be in this kind of conversation and also track each other in it. And Beth and Sarah, I would love to also, while folks are maybe thinking about this and responding, if you wanted to consider a little bit just personally for you, like why is this work important to you, or why is it important today, and how do you see this as part of the healing that's needed? I'd love to just hear your words on that as well. So while you're thinking about that, let's see if anyone's sharing what's going on in them. So folks are saying that there's sadness, specifically around the mission schools, that this is really important work and great information shared. Sadness that we just have to have these conversations, but thankful that they're happening. Folks are saying this is very informative. We need time to process it, learning a lot. Yeah, still sitting with the knowledge that millions of ancestors have been stolen by the government. Yeah, that's a hit. That's a hit for sure for those who don't know. So good to learn these things and to have tools to respond with care. I agree. Yeah, I feel the reminder in my heart about not assuming that given our or my assumptions are derived from our socialization, which is not inclusive of everyone's rituals, practices, and ways of knowing. Um, Wonderful. Oh, that's wow. There's a cool thing happening in the chat. This has been excellent and very moving. I'm researching our denomination and congregation's involvement with boarding schools. I'm very sad. I hope it's okay to verbalize this, but Sarah, in the chat, there's someone who has a dictionary of the Osage language printed in the 1920s that was their dad's, and they would like to gift it to the tribe. Should they connect with you?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Well, this is let's see. Yeah. Yeah, just a lot of gratitude. Thank you both for being here. I'd love to just, yeah, include some more of your own personal reflections on this work. And then we can share some next steps that people can take as part of this journey unfolds.
Very well. I'd like to make sure Beth has the last word. And I think, as a non-native archaeologist, it was always a goal of mine to try and, meet and exceed the ethical standards of archaeology. And being from Missouri and being from St. Louis specifically, which has a really public history of destroying mounds for the expansion of the city, it always, was just, it really bothered me for a long time, even when I was younger and I didn't fully articulate that, very well. And so later on in my career, getting an opportunity to work for the Osage Nation was just such a blessing. And, it is really emotional work. It is humbling work. It is, one day I'm heartbroken and the next I'm, soaring above mountains. It's amazing. It's so worthwhile too. And it has been just such a privilege and an honor. And I think that, there's something that I have the also a blessing of I meet the Osage elders once a month and they give me my marching orders. And just the opportunity there to sit and listen to them, and they are so willing to share what they want to happen and their perspective has been so invaluable to me to get this work done. So it's just been so eye-opening every day. You learn a thing that you didn't even know you didn't know, but it is always worthwhile. Every day is worthwhile. Any minute win of just getting someone to call me back is absolutely worthwhile. And I am so grateful that I can do this for the Osage and that they've asked me to help them accomplish this goal. So I just like to sit in that even on the frustrating days and the difficult days.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great to hear. I think for me, repatriation is pretty much everything. I think cultural preservation and restoration is one of the best things that you can do for Indian tribes. I think about everything that my ancestors did to preserve the culture that I know and that I continue to practice, and all of the sacrifices that they made. And I'm just trying to do that for the next generations. So.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. If we can just give our love in the chat for our two speakers today, Beth and Sarah. We're so grateful to be, in this conversation with you, to have had this conversation, and to be collaborating with you in this way. So thank you so much for this time and for all the work you do. Whew, okay. Well, we would love to transition into some next steps. that we'd like to emphasize for folks. Uh, First, we would love to invite you all to read this guide, this beautiful, beautiful guide that we made with our friends. Sacred Grounds, a Right Relations Guidebook on Native Burials and Cultural Items. You can click the link in the chat for the web version as well as the PDF that you can read directly. Secondly, if you think there's a chance that your community could be in one of these situations, and chances are they are, please look at the guide and share it with your community members who might be able to work with you on potential next steps, whether that's going through your archive, doing some research about potential burial sites on your land, or talking with your community leadership about reaching out to tribal nations that you could be in collaboration with about any of those kinds of things that you might find. Third, if you are connected to any of the 89 Catholic religious communities that ran boarding schools, please consider ways that you might reach out to them. If it's your own community, the thing I just said applies to you, but consider ways you might reach out to them and ask, inquire as to whether or not they have gone through their archives and reached out to the impacted Native tribes or families or lineal descendants about burial sites, but also about archives related to their community. It's extremely important to name that archives and burial sites, I mean, we've already said this, but they're very sensitive resources, and they can be really important and healing to families of survivors, while also being very triggering at the same time. So reaching out to tribal governments of those nations and of those communities, they might have entire systems set up for reaching families and keeping track of archives related to boarding schools. So that is a specific request that we're making to folks who are connected to those institutions that were involved in boarding schools. Lastly, if you want to support your community in going deeper with grappling with the impacts of boarding schools on Indigenous communities, we would love to recommend signing up to host a free screening of the award-winning documentary Sugarcane as part of their Faith Community Tour. We hosted our own discussion about the film here about 2 weeks ago with the Land Justice Futures community, and I'll say it was incredibly powerful. And so we'd love to extend that invitation to you. You can sign up and get a whole toolkit, and the Sugarcane film team will help you host your own screening with ease and really meaningful power. So those are our asks to you in this moment. All right. Well, thank you so much, Beth, and thank you, Sarah, again for speaking with us today. This has been so powerful and informative. And thank you to my team for being here. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Denise and Amy, for supporting with this call. And thank you all for being our people and coming to these events to be part of this movement.